Good morning, everyone. We are 1 year into President Trump's overhaul of U.S. trade policy, and the world is confronting the fact that amidst the uncertainty and the changing trade policy, one thing is certain, and that is that tariffs are here to stay. And we are in a world of managed trade, not free trade. So just last Friday, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down some of the president's claimed legal authorities. But he has since made clear that he is not deterred in his tariff policy. We're going to dig into that court case today and what comes next in Washington and among America's trading partners at this Washington Post Intelligence Weekly Briefing. Every week, we bring together our analysts and thought leaders across sectors to help us go quick and deep on issues that are shaping the business and policy landscape. I'm Louisa Savage, editorial director of WP Intelligence, and our mission is to help decision makers see around corners of policy and industry trends. Our subscribers receive concise intelligence reports with actionable recommendations across AI and tech, energy and climate, global security, and healthcare. We have a graphics library that you can use and share, exclusive interviews, and live briefings where we sort out developments that are changing the decisions you need to make. So today we're looking at what comes next in U.S. trade policy and how the world is changing its economic relations in response. To help walk us through all this today, we have two guests with very keen insights into this issue. Josh Rogan is our lead global security analyst, and he has been bringing us the inside story of many of the administration's trade negotiations with countries around the world. Welcome, Josh.
Great to be here.
Great to have you. And Nazak Nikakdar is the chair of National Security Practice at Wiley Rein. And from 2018 to 2021, she served as Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Industry and Analysis at the International Trade Administration. She also did the duties of the Commerce Undersecretary for Industry. She's a former Georgetown University adjunct professor in international law and is a member of the WP Intelligence Global Security Council. Thank you so much, Nazak, for being here.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
It's great to have your expertise. So here's how we'll organize our conversation for the next hour. First, we'll talk about the Supreme Court decision that overturned the legal basis for some of the Trump administration's tariff, and we'll talk about what comes next. Second, we'll get into how trading partners around the world are adjusting to a year of U.S. tariff policy. And third, we'll look ahead to the planned meeting between President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping. And I'd like to thank the audience for all the great questions that you sent in ahead of the briefing. We've used them to help shape what we'll talk about. And throughout this conversation, I invite you to drop your questions and comments into the Q&A, and we'll take relevant questions off the iPad as we go along. So with that, let's dive right in to the Supreme Court ruling. Josh, the Supreme Court ruling said just a week ago that the president had exceeded his authority and that his emergency tariffs were unconstitutional. But since then, he announced a 10% global tariff. So what exactly did the court say that he can do and that he can't do? And what is he going to do instead?
Thanks so much, Louisa. So the Supreme Court, after months of deliberation, issued a 6-3 ruling that determined that the Trump administration's use of one particular law to justify one particular set of tariffs exceeded their authority, and that is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, also known as IEEPA. Now, this law provides the president with broad authorities in the case of an emergency. What you define as an emergency, what President Trump defines as an emergency, and what the Supreme Court defines as an emergency could all be different things. But regardless, what the ruling effectively does is it requires the administration to stop collecting tariffs based on the use of this law in these instances. And to date, that means that the $140 billion or so of tariffs that the administration has already collected based on this law are now in limbo, and that the trade deals that the administration struck with countries which involved these tariffs, but not only these tariffs, are now somewhat in question. And the administration's path forward, as announced by the president and his top advisors, is in some ways charted and in some ways unclear. And what the president and his top officials have said is that for them, replacing the ability to collect tariffs under IEEPA is their priority. And they have a plan, a strategy to do that involves a temporary authority under what's known as Section 122 that can replace the exact 10% that was struck down by the Supreme Court's invalidation of IEEPA justification, and then a series of other tariff measures under a series of other justifications that they plan to roll out over time. Now, what we don't know is when those measures will be rolled out, exactly what they will look like, and how they will affect our trade relationships and our deals with countries all over the world. And this has injected a huge amount of uncertainty into the international trading system, which had been somewhat settled after a year of turbulence and volatility. And it looks like 2016 is going to be another year of turbulence and volatility in trade, in tariffs, and in international business writ large.
And I'm sure you meant 2026, but you're so right. I think there was a level of uncertainty that people had become accustomed to, and now we're adding additional questions. One question on many people's mind, Zach, is what does happen to the tariffs that countries have already paid under the IEEPA that now we're told was unconstitutional? Will they get this money back? How can they do that?
Yeah, so I mean, there will be a process. There's sort of two options that are available, and I think we're going to be going the Court of International Trade court mandated route. But the Court of International Trade, this is the lower court that had and it first ruled against the president's use of IEEPA. It's ruled that it has the authority to order refunds. The Department of Justice has already stipulated that it won't challenge the Court of International Trade's refund authority. The statutory filing deadline for litigation is ongoing. Many companies have already filed suits for tariff refunds, but the filing deadline doesn't run out until next February at the earliest. And it's worth underscoring that the Court of International Trade's authority extends to awarding interest on monetary judgments. So not only refund of the tariffs, but interest. That's how customs normally works when tariff rates, as a result of normal sort of administrative trade actions, increase, importers have to pay the increase plus interest. If they go down, the customs has to pay the importers interest back. So interest repayment is also very much embedded into the tariff repayment systems. The administration also may set up its own process, set up its own internal agency process for importers to seek refunds. But it really looks like right now the administration is relying on the courts. I also want to underscore how massive this is going to be. I mean, 177 billion plus collected so far. If that has to be returned, it's that plus interest. The downstream customers aren't going to get who may have paid some portion of the tariffs. Some of it's not always passed through. Many importers have said that with their foreign exporters, they've negotiated price reductions, so the U.S. importers could have better absorbed the tariffs. Of course, sometimes it is passed through the customers. What's really shocking to me is that the importers are going to get this enormous windfall, and very little is going to go back to the customers. That said, I also think that administration is very much looking to disincentivize importers from petitioning the court or petitioning the government to seek tariff collection. It does have legal authority to do that, and it may, I wouldn't discount the possibility that the administration may use some legal authorities to induce importers to not seek the collection of refunds because of the economic impact it'll have when you compound the tariffs paid plus the interest that may have to be paid back.
When you say disincentivize, what does that mean?
I mean, I would look at it this way. I think these IEEPA tariffs were invoked in terms of national emergency, right? So India's purchase of Russian oil, which India has said is going to continue. India's purchase of Russian oil, the U.S. government was trying to use IEEPA as an economic pressure campaign. I think the administration is looking now and saying, I've lost a year, or I've lost X number of months of my economic pressure campaign. So maybe I'm going to go forward and think about leveraging new authority and maybe, temporarily double tariffs for an interim period of time, so that I can make up for the lost time. And then those importers who don't want to seek a tariff refund would be able to get half, only pay half of that tariff. I'm only speculating, not because the administration has decided the route it's going to go, but if one were to think of one sort of viable legal way that the administration could disincentivize tariffs, that's certainly one that is legally viable. And again, if one were to understand the logic behind it, the administration could very well look to say, look, I need to make up time because I've lost a year or however many months in my economic pressure campaign against China for fentanyl, against Mexico for fentanyl, against India for transacting with Russia and for energy products. So it makes sense, but nobody really knows which direction the administration is going. I don't even think they do, but these things are certainly going to be contemplated.
That is fascinating. Josh, there was no question in the State of the Union that President Trump is not deterred by this Supreme Court case. He still very much believes in tariffs, and he sees them as a way of offsetting income tax revenue as well. So just given that, what do you think trading partners should expect in the year ahead? And you've talked to so many officials around the world. What are you hearing from them? What are they expecting? And what do you think they should expect?
Sure. I mean, to be clear, the president sees these tariffs primarily as instruments of leverage, not instruments of tax collection, although it is true that his officials often send mixed messages about that. And even the president said both things in his State of the Union address. But speaking with officials and lawmakers, it's clear that what the president wants is to use the threat or actual implementation of tariffs to get whatever it is that he wants out of any particular country at any particular time. It could be to try to pressure them to stop buying Russian oil. It could be to get them to not prosecute one of his friends, as we saw in Brazil. It could be after he has a bad phone call with someone and he just wants to punish them for not giving him credit on solving a war that he didn't solve, as we saw in India. So what the president and his team are doing are they're trying to replace that leverage. And because they are so willing to be unprecedented and creative in their use of tariffs and leverage, they can certainly do that. So what the reaction from foreign governments is twofold. For the ones that have a deal or some semblance of a deal or an agreement to strike a deal or whatever it is, the last thing they want to do is start from scratch. So despite the fact that that deal was based on a tariff regime that no longer exists, they're likely to just hold their nose and just stay with it, because why would they want to open up and in fact, what the president said is that if they try to open up their trade deals or their trade agreements, he'll be twice as punitive and twice as aggressive. And so he basically threatened them into staying in the deals despite the fact that some of the tariff authority doesn't exist. And they're all going to do that. The implementation of those deals is going to slow because of the uncertainty in how goods are going to move and what's coming next. We could have new tariffs on semiconductors. We could have new tariffs on pharmaceuticals, lumber, agriculture, you name it. So in that environment, if the Trump administration goes to country X and says, well, you promised to invest in this or that, they're going to say, well, we're probably going to wait and see what happens. And then for those countries that don't have a deal or in the middle of negotiations, well, you could imagine that those negotiations just got a lot more complicated. So until this is sorted out, which again could take months, if not the entire year, it's going to be tough to strike new deals. And I think what we're going to see is that in August, when the Trump administration's temporary authority to replace the 10% tariffs under Section 122 expires, at that point, the administration has a decision to make. Do they go hard and really try to strong arm a bunch of these countries? Or do they realize that in that election season, their political interest is in actually juicing the economy as much as possible, which means not being really tariff crazy? My instinct is that it'll be the latter. But again with President Trump, you never know.
Well, Nizak, there's an audience question that came in that I'll direct to you. How does the recent Supreme Court ruling impact trade relations with countries that have negotiated waivers and reductions in U.S. tariffs?
So I think what we're seeing right now, and it's a great question, what we're seeing right now is a little bit of sort of countries posturing, right? To follow up from what Josh said, there's right now the US government has 19 agreements, 12 are only framework agreements, and then 7 are actual agreements. I think really with respect to both the framework agreements and the actual agreements, I think what I found surprising was that countries didn't typically consider IEPA being overturned, so they didn't kind of give themselves an escape clause in these agreements. But of course, now that IEPA is gone, it somewhat, only very modestly increases their negotiating leverage. I think many are posturing. What is in Trump's sort of playbook, and what are the cards that he holds? Well, at the end of the day, I think these trade agreements are going to remain intact, whether they're framework or actual agreements, because the tariff authority that the president has used really to gain leverage over these countries for these trade agreements is the Section 232 tariffs. Those are the national security tariffs that the president's already imposed on articles like steel, aluminum, autos, trucks, copper, Excel, and lumber and timber products. So those, when we're looking at EU, when we're looking at the UK, when we're looking at Japan, South Korea, India, those are all framework agreements, but those countries really rely on steel, aluminum, and/or auto exports to the United States. They've been able to negotiate Section 232 tariff reductions. So I think Trump is going to hold the current tariffs as leverage for the countries to not get out of their agreements. Taiwan has an actual agreement with the United States, but Taiwan's key Achilles heel is going to be the tariffs on semiconductor exports. That's a Section 232 where the proclamation, phase 2 of the proclamation by the president is forthcoming. The story there in terms of the investigation leading to the proclamation, that story isn't done yet. So the president is ready to take action. That is going to continue to hold Taiwan's feet to the fire. And let's underscore also the fact that the president has said, I have more tariff authority. He has Section 301 authority, retaliatory tariffs against unfair trade, Section 338 authority, dormant authority that he could easily dust off. It's still valid law to go after countries with tariffs of up to 50% for discriminating against the United States. And again, lots of Section 232 authority. What I'm going to be watching for is really whether the president invokes these legal authorities to impose tariffs within the box of how these laws are constructed, or is his interpretation of his legal authority going to expand beyond what Congress intended? Remember, his expansion was invalidated by the Supreme Court when he used IEPA. So it's really important for the president to stay within the four corners of what Congress has intended. And if he veers out of this, the courts have been emboldened. The Court of International Trade has been emboldened. The Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit has been emboldened to rule against the president. The Supreme Court obviously has demonstrated that it is willing to not side with the president on key issues. So could these new tariff authorities be litigated? Absolutely. If, again, the president veers out of the four corners of what Congress set out legally for him.
No, that's a great point. Well, let's talk about the other side of this equation, how some of our trading partners are responding after this year of so much tumult in tariff policy. Josh, you recently attended the Munich Security Conference, and you spoke to a lot of officials and executives from around the world, and you published a report that we can bring on screen. And you entitled it, "The World is De-risking from the United States." And that's such an interesting concept that we should dig into. So let's start with Europe. What does de-risking look like for Europeans?
Right. Well, this was now 3 weeks ago at the Munich Security Conference. And it's fair to say that European countries, their leaders, their businessmen, were fairly consistent in expressing their severe anger and dismay with the Trump administration's approach to Europe, specifically President Trump's threats to attack Greenland and acquire Greenland, a NATO country, against its will, the president's tariffs against European countries, and the president's staff's interference in internal European politics, including by supporting pro-Russian parties in various European countries, and scolding Europeans for their approach to social media, etc. So the Europeans had a lot of grievances. Now, to be clear, the Europeans always have a lot of grievances. And I've never been to a Munich Security Conference that wasn't full of Europeans having a lot of grievances with the United States. But this was different and worse. And what I heard was a consistent mantra that the populations in many of these countries, especially in Western Europe, but not only in Western Europe, in countries like Poland, Germany, France, you name it, had been so scorned and so turned off by the Trump administration's actions that their leaders now had to respond by taking practical, long-lasting measures to both insulate themselves from the United States' ability to punish their economies and to distance themselves from the Trump administration specifically. Now, what that looks like on the ground is varies country by country, and whether or not these countries are able to actually do that also varies by country. But the basic outlines of it are this: a lot of countries had been de-risking and decoupling and protecting their supply chains and their markets from China, and now they're doing it from the United States, from both China and the United States. And what that means practically is making deals with other actors, including what the EU and India call the mother of all trade deals, which was struck just a couple of weeks before the conference, an India-UK trade deal, and then EU outreach to all sorts of other actors. And, will it work? That remains to be seen. It's a completely other question. But in the halls of the Munich Security Conference, it was clear that all of these countries and their businesses were looking for ways to protect their exposure from the United States, and also to protect to de-risk their dependence on the U.S. market, which has been weaponized against them. Now, Asian countries have the same kind of problem, but different circumstances, and it's probably a different webinar, but suffice to say that Europe is now trying to de-risk from the United States in ways that it hadn't contemplated before. And the implications of that will only be felt over time. And as that happens, the turnover of these governments inside of Europe is directly related. And what I mean by that is that there's a turn away from governments that are seen to be on the outs, like the government of French President Emmanuel Macron, which is expected to not win the next election next year. And then we've seen new alliances, like German Chancellor Merz calling for a more independent Europe, and making common cause with Italian Prime Minister Meloni. And the politics of Europe are shifting fast, and some of that is a response to U.S. policy, and some of that isn't. But either way, these shifts are, I think, generational and in some ways irreversible.
Mm-hmm. And I would like to invite our audience to please send in your questions so we have time to address them before the end of the briefing. Nazak, I think Josh just summed up the conversation in Europe. Moving the lens closer to home, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, he gave a much discussed speech earlier this year at Davos where he called on, quote, middle powers to stop operating under what he called a pretense of the old global system, and instead to unite and counter great power coercion. And he had this memorable quote: "If we're not at the table, we're on the menu." And it was interesting to note that before he gave this speech, he'd made a trip to Beijing to negotiate a deal where Canada will now allow the import of 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles at a 6.1% tariff rate, where they used to face 100% tariffs, basically blocking them from the market. And in exchange, China is going to buy reduce tariffs and buy more Canadian agricultural goods, where they'd been putting a squeeze on Canadian farmers. And it was interesting that he called the relationship with the U.S. deeper and more multifaceted, but the relationship with China, he said, was more predictable. I'm curious what your takeaways are from these moves by Canada, where the conversation about de-risking from this huge intertwined economic relationship has kind of reached a fever pitch, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think how I would sum up what the Prime Minister Carney said, and it actually dovetails with what Josh said, is countries are just engaging in self-help. They understand that there are certainly trade frictions with the United States. Trump is demanding more from them. For this, I really wanted to underscore. I mean, even before President Trump's first administration, the U.S. bound tariff rates on average were about 3.4%. Applied tariffs were 1.6%. When we compare that to Europe, to Japan, to South Korea, to other trading partners, I mean, when you combine their tariff rates plus their market protections in terms of standards and other non-tariff barriers, it was really in the order of magnitude of 10, 20, sometimes higher percentage. So one, fundamentally, the US among all of our trading partners has had really the most open borders. But okay, so we now the president in his first term and really doubling down in his second term, demanding more for our trading partners. Open your borders or we're going to retaliate. Um, that has led to that's part of the US engaging in self-help. I think the US has felt very disillusioned by the World Trade Organization. It was in 2017 that myself and a number of lawyers and industries in the United States went to meet with European leaders and the WTO leaders to talk about sort of China's status in the World Trade Organization. And somebody pretty high up at the WTO said the following: the World Trade Organization can't decide between our two largest members because we're going to cease to exist. And to me, that was a shocking statement because the WTO, the entity that the member countries, the world has entrusted in helping bring order to the trading system through setting rules and adjudicating dispute, is now signaling that they're more interested in self-preservation than to actually do what member countries had entrusted them to do, which was set the rules and adjudicate disputes fairly. So this has caused the US government, Trump administration, we saw the first signs of this, really pushing back against the the WTO, expressing the lack of confidence in these international institutions, the Trump administration engaging in self-help and pushing back against countries on fair trade barriers. And now these countries Carney summed it up perfectly, trying to engage in self-help. Carney is now looking to Australia, South Korea, Brazil. Those are heavily protected markets as well. So it is a little bit naive for Canada to think that expanding relationships with other countries where their markets are even more protected than the United States is going to be sort of easy for him. Canada is going to face trade frictions as well. And I think the big question is, will there be a new international order that is able to sort of bring order and dispute resolution to this ecosystem? I think for right now, we're going to see lots of bilateral, small country group deals, again, while everybody engages in self-help. The trend with Canada in terms of relying on China's EV is the same trend we're seeing in the UK, same trend we're seeing across Europe, which is let's just invite Chinese products in here. Let's just invite Chinese investments in our borders. They will bring jobs. They'll bring in cheap goods, certainly. They'll bring jobs. They'll bring know-how. The problem there is that China's goods aren't cheap. They're distortedly priced. And when China gains monopoly, then it will use its leverage, like it has with the United States in rare earths and magnets, to induce as an inducement. But we've seen this playbook before over and over again, though, too. When China invests in your country, right, it doesn't bring know-how. It'll temporarily bring jobs, and then it'll wipe out competing industries through subsidies, through distorted market structure, and then it takes that factory back to China. We also saw this in Europe with Nexperia recently. It'll take the factories, it'll take the jobs back to China, leaving the domestic industry where it had previously invested completely hollowed out. We see this playbook over and over and over by the Chinese. It's not like any of this is unpredictable. So yes, Carney's right. the behavior with China is predictable. It's predictable, though, in a very, very negative way. Countries need to be careful. And what's stunning to me is after, 20 plus years of experience with China since its entry into the WTO about the hollowing out of domestic industries, countries still aren't learning that with trading with China is a one-way street where China always wins and China's trading partners lose.
So I think that the point you're making is there's risk in each direction. There's risk in the relationship with the U.S. right now, but there's certainly big risks in the relationship with China. I want to bring in a question from our audience. To what extent are other countries unwilling to buy U.S. debt as sort of part of this shift? Do either one of you want to take that on?
I'll start by saying,
go ahead.
Gosh. I was going to start by saying, I think one of the things that's at least underscoring, and I'm glad we're bringing this up, Trump's sort of push against the international trading system and maybe to some its erratic behavior, is he really is very troubled by the 38.7 plus trillion dollar US debt. And then this trade deficit of about $1 trillion in goods that just seems to keep ballooning over and over again. And so I think he's very concerned that with this increasing debt, it's going to be very, very hard for countries to really buy national debt. And so he's trying to do everything possibly to keep the dollar strong, bring FDI into the United States and reduce the trade deficit through exporting more and importing less to make a dent in this massive debt that we have to keep the dollar strong.
Yeah, I would just say, the U.S. trade deficit in 2025 was almost exactly the same as it was in 2024, around $900 billion. So after all of that, all of those tariffs, all of that disruption, all of that, political sort of maneuvering, all of those relationships put into question, U.S. trade deficit didn't really change at all. And so that can't be exactly what the administration wanted to happen. And when it comes to the dollar, I hear really conflicting messages because the dollar weakened significantly in 2025, which sometimes I hear Trump administration officials say was important because, of course, it helps U.S. exports. And then sometimes I hear them say that actually we want a strong dollar. So you could imagine that's just really, really confusing. And, I think that just adds to the uncertainty. And when it comes to people buying the debt, there's always been the threat that eventually this debt problem will result in the failure of our ability to get people to buy it. What we've seen is that the rates are very high, and the bond market reacts to this uncertainty of these policies in ways that exacerbates our economic problems. And those countries that really have us by the throat because they own so much of our debt have enormous leverage over us. And I think we've seen China threaten to use that. I think we've seen Japan threaten to use that. And that's one of those things that even President Trump cannot ignore. And so, I hear a lot of rhetoric about, the debt, but, what did we see? We saw massive tax cuts and we saw massive spending increases and a trade deficit that didn't move at all. So, and a weakened dollar. So I guess that there's just a gap here between some of the administration's rhetoric and the reality of the numbers as we see them on the ground.
I do want to add one thing. I do want to add one. And I think in all fairness, it really does take, there's always a lag time, and it really does take the economy some time to adjust. So even if there are tariffs, we're not going to see sort of a massive reduction in the deficit immediately, but things just need time. But really, I wanted to underscore something that Josh said. There is this sort of debate within macroeconomists and certainly within DC and the government about, do we want a strong dollar or do we want a weak dollar? Certainly the weak dollar improves exports, right? And it improves our position in terms of as a trading partner on the world stage. But a weak dollar is also, many feel that it's very, very dangerous as China is trying to roll out the RMB, get the RMB to, at least in many countries or in many trading segments, displace the US dollar. So then there's also this imperative to keep the dollar strong so that countries stay on the US dollar. So it's the US government is in a little bit of a catch-22. You want to do one thing and weaken the dollar, but on the other hand, you've got to keep the dollar strong because of China. So these are really, really tough issues that the US government is grappling with.
So I want to keep on the frame of how partners are reacting. So we've talked about Europe, we've talked about Canada, but Josh, you've also been following the relationship between the U.S. and India, which you mentioned earlier in the context of the New Deal between India and the EU. The U.S.-India relationship has just been fascinating. It's careened from a breakdown to a trade agreement. So you did this great report for us on this topic. How is India responding to their treatment by the White House right now?
Right. Well, after 8 months of stalemate, the U.S. and India struck a trade agreement last month that was almost exactly on the terms that were put on the table 8 months ago. And the reason that we had 8 months of no movement was twofold. One, because President Trump felt slighted that Prime Minister Modi wouldn't give him credit for solving the war in Kashmir, credit that he didn't deserve, by the way. And secondly, because they had a very bad personal phone call in which Trump threatened to double tariffs, and then he doubled tariffs on India, ostensibly to get them to stop buying Russian oil. But it was really just a personal dispute between these two very powerful men who used to be friends, now don't like each other anymore. Bottom line is that the deal that they struck can be portrayed as a win by both sides. It will open up some Indian markets, and it will allow Indian exports more ability to sell some things in the United States. But the damage to the relationship is done, and what the Indians realized, and I spoke with many of them in Munich, is that they can't let this happen again, and that means they can't depend on the United States to be their number one export market anymore. They knew that they had to de-risk their incoming supply chains. They didn't realize that they had to de-risk their export markets because they were weaponized against them. So what they did in the last year, India struck more trade agreements and trade deals than it had in the 25 years previous put together. EU, the UK, Oman, you name it. And so that's their strategy is, after 25 years of multiple U.S. administrations trying to draw India closer to the U.S. strategically, economically, militarily, the Indian government decided that's over, and now they're going to go back to more of a balancing position. They've warmed somewhat with China, although there's limits to that warming. They've definitely warmed with Russia, which is not a great thing for our interests strategically vis-a-vis Russia. And inside the system, they're looking for other partners to concentrate and diversify their economy, but also their defense purchasing, their technology purchasing, you name it. So that's the end of what I would say is about 25 years of the U.S. and India moving closer strategically. And now India is convinced that in a multipolar world, they can't depend on the United States any more than they do right now.
Zach, well, given everything we've just been talking about, both on the legal shifts, the anticipated sort of adaptation that you anticipate by the Trump administration to the court ruling, and then the way that these trade patterns outside the U.S. are sort of realigning right now, what does this all mean for U.S. business leaders? If you're a business leader right now, what should you be thinking about as we go forward into the next year and the rest of this administration, frankly?
I mean, there is going to be a period of uncertainty. I think when you were sharing Josh's writing, there was a really important sentence to highlight, which was countries were hedging, right? I mean, I think right now hedging their bets. They don't know right now between the sort of U.S.-China dispute who is going to prevail, and so they're going to continue to do business with the U.S. They're going to continue to do business with China, with Russia, whoever, because they just don't know. They don't know who to side with, and I think it's relevant to the answer to the question you posed. Is I'm also seeing a dramatic shift in African countries and countries that actually, South America, that have mineral resources, who've been sort of exploited by China so much that now they're looking to partner more and more with the United States. That to me is really dramatic and really rewarding. And there are some things that the US government is doing right. So it really should double down and bring confidence to our trading relationship with our trading partners. In terms of businesses, I mean, I think every single country is going to create a unique situation. Every industry is going to be unique. But at the core, I think every country, they just need to understand, diversify supply chains, understand the geopolitical climate and risks those countries vis-a-vis in that country geographically, politically itself, but also versus in that country vis-a-vis its relationship with its other trading partners, certainly the United States. What keeps me up at night and what I really try to advise businesses is, look, you have to look at your supply chains. It's an exercise that wasn't imperative as much before, but it really is growing to be an imperative if you have supply chains in China or certainly in the Indo-Pacific. China has restricted exports of rare earths and magnets to us. There are a lot more supply chain vulnerabilities that we have in China, industrial diamonds, chemicals, etc. A good amount of semiconductors. So look at those supply chains, try to de-risk as quickly as possible, because if the US government's prediction about China and Taiwan is right, once China acquires Taiwan, however it does, sort of in the near term, and the US government's prediction is about 2027, then that supply chain very well may go offline, and China will 100% restrict more and more exports to the United States. I've been predicting the rare earths. I've been predicting the industrial diamond export ban to the United States. More will be forthcoming. De-risk away from China and diversify. The other thing that I would advise businesses is that, just expect a period of uncertainty. It's really difficult to do business in a period of uncertainty, but that's what we're going to have, because the reality is that the entire global trading system is under a lot of pressure, and it is displaying a lot of cracks. And countries are going to engage in self-help, as I mentioned, and countries are going to continue engaging in self-help until some semblance of a new order, and maybe several new orders, emerges. And so understand that uncertainty is just going to be the name of the game. Double down, and for investors, where the US government is making investments in critical defense related capabilities like rare earths, like industrial, like 3D manufacturing, etc. Those are key areas. Batteries, semiconductors, those are key areas to focus on in terms of the US supply chain, because if the US government is putting lots of money in the industrial capabilities in the United States, then it's more incentivized to use trade tools to protect those markets against predatory import competition. One example is a recommendation I gave the administration months and months ago in terms of not using tariffs, but price floors to keep prices stable in terms of imports, right? China tends to sort of underprice under tariffs, but if you use price floors for imports, that creates more stability. More practices like that in partnership with our allies. Those are some of the things that can bring some business certainty, but expect some uncertainty in the near term.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to make sure we look ahead to this visit with China, since you brought it up. Josh, what does all this de-risking mean for China, and what are you expecting in this conversation between the presidents?
Right. Well, after the president and Chinese President Xi Jinping struck a temporary trade truce in September, there has been an edict driven through the administration down to the agencies and the bureaucracy not to do anything competitive that's really going to upset China or upset that fragile truce until President Trump goes to Beijing in April. And that has manifested in all sorts of interesting ways. For example, it seems that our latest arms sales to Taiwan are on hold. That's pretty interesting. And and then with the technology restrictions, new competitive measures to restrict sales of high-end U.S. frontier technologies to China have actually been reversed and been loosened. sometimes in exchange for a fee, often after heavy lobbying by these tech companies like NVIDIA in particular. And then when you look at, even the China competitive initiatives, like at the State Department, they have this thing called Pax Silica, which is an entire diplomatic initiative to de-risk our technology supply chains from China. But if you look on the website, the word China doesn't appear on it. I went to the opening event, they never said the word China. So everybody knows inside the administration not to do anything on China that might convince President Trump that might upset President Xi Jinping. So that has a chilling effect all down the line. It doesn't mean that the competitive actions, some of them still don't go on, but anything new, anything that might, upset Beijing is just off limits. Now, what happens at this summit in April? Well, we don't know, but the options are, another extension of the truce, which could include agricultural concessions from China, but also could include technology concessions from the United States. That's like, if you ask most people, that seems like the most likely outcome. Maybe it won't go well, and then President Trump will switch to a more competitive stance and then free his people to take more competitive actions to protect U.S. companies and U.S. markets and U.S. consumers from predatory Chinese economic aggression. But I don't know. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen. And everybody also knows that the Chinese are holding their threat to restrict rare earth and critical minerals of all kinds over President Trump's head and over the U.S. economy's head. And it's a real threat that we can't ignore. We saw that just last week when the Chinese government was angry at the Japanese government. They stopped the export of all of these materials that that pretty important for all of the Japanese manufacturing initiatives. So they've really sort of got us over a barrel when it comes to these rare earths and critical minerals. And I totally agree with what Nazak said, is that the U.S. government is heavily focused on fixing that and devoting a lot of time and resources. And if I were a U.S. business anywhere near any of these things, that's what I would try to access, because there are hundreds of billions of dollars going into the effort to fix that. But that's going to take several years at minimum. And even so, you need things like price floors in order to give any company, commercial or otherwise, that's trying to access U.S. plans to de-risk supply chains from China or anywhere else. You're going to need to ensure that they have a business case that's going to result in customers that will pay money that will justify these investments, which will be more expensive than their Chinese counterparts and on a smaller scale and take years to develop if it works at all. So it's a pretty dire situation. And the leverage in the U.S.-China relationship in the first Trump administration was the other way around. And the Chinese economy was on the ropes, and the president's team also vacillated between engagement and competition and confrontation, sometimes logically and sometimes not logically. But anyway, now the shoe is on the other foot, and it's clear that Beijing has the leverage, and Trump knows that, and that affects everything that we're talking about today. And that is what hangs over his visit to Beijing in April.
Nazak, if you were advising the president and his team on what their priorities should be on this visit and what a win might look like, what would you tell them?
One, I think the administration is a couple of things that it's doing really, really well is, investing domestic capabilities and pushing out American exports, AI exports, tech exports to the rest of the world to displace China. I don't think anything good. I don't think that there's going to be a win from this discussion. I think the president and Xi Jinping are going to meet. We're going to see the repeat of what we saw in South Korea. The president pressing Xi Jinping to get us rare earths and magnets, not impose any more export restrictions. Xi Jinping is going to say, yeah, and then they leave, and the same thing is going to happen. What I think is going to be pivotal and is going to change, the reason we haven't felt the full effect of China's export bans against the United States yet is that we've been working off stockpiles. Those stockpiles are going to run out by the middle of this year. We have not felt the full economic impact of China's export bans. I'm very, very concerned that we're going to get there by the middle of this year. And whatever happens in April between in the meetings, Xi Jinping has made one thing clear. The People's Liberation Army's 100th year anniversary is in 2027. Xi Jinping is going to go into his unprecedented fourth term. As Josh said, he is much more powerful now than he was ever before. They have the U.S. over the barrel. If Xi Jinping really wanted to negotiate tech for magnets, he would have given us magnets that we need for critical capabilities. China has not been giving us the core magnets that we need for our critical capabilities. It's signaled that it has zero intention of doing a April meeting or otherwise by the president. And we're going to see this trend continue. And again, what's really worrying me is how dramatic is the impact going to be to the U.S. economy when our stockpiles run out. When we get to that point, when we see these earning reports by companies that say, I can't produce anything else that requires a motor because I can't get the magnets, I think the president is then going to realize that this approach of trying to negotiate with China, and I don't disagree with him. He's got to do everything he can, but I think he's going to see that hit rock bottom. And then I think we're going to see about face by the administration and going maximum economic pressure against China to induce them to change, because they'll realize that the conciliatory approach has gotten us nowhere.
One issue, Nizak, that we've been hearing about with increased frequency is the pharmaceutical input supply chain and China's sort of dominance there. Do you see this as becoming a bigger issue in the year ahead?
Yeah, a massive issue. And I think there's so many there's facets to this in terms of sort of the core pharmaceuticals, the API precursors, but also where these clinical trials are happening outside the United States because of the lax regulatory structure. The U.S. is still grappling, after all of these years, still grappling with how do you incentivize, the domestic production of the APIs, the domestic production of, or the domestic clinical trials testing, that entire core supply chain that needs to be here. I think the government has some really good ideas that are in play. They're socializing it through the government. But what do we do during the gap period where we've got to get all of our regulatory supply chain structure in place to be self-sufficient? And yet we don't have the time to do that. I will also mention that, because China was so behind the United States, the Western nations in terms of industrial development, the US, Europe, we almost had the luxury of restricting ourselves through overregulation because China was so far behind. Now that China has dramatically caught up in an unprecedented time frame, we're now have bogged down with all of these regulatory strangleholds or handcuffs. We're trying to deregulate, but we're finding that we can't do this fast enough in the time that we need. So that's going to be the tough part for the United States, for Europe. I think this is where the United States really does need to rely on allies, as Josh said, in terms of packed silica, as I mentioned, in terms of sort of some other sort of rare earth mining related supply chains. The U.S. is looking to forge greater relationships with allies too. So on one hand, demand better, more fair trade. The administration is whacking allies with a stick. But on the other hand, it is giving allies pretty solid olive branches to do business together, to again de-risk away from China and these critical supply chains that we're so far behind in building.
Sure, and certainly on the medical one, that's where India could play a role. Well, in all our briefings, we like to look ahead. Josh, talk about what you're working on next for our subscribers. And I know you have a tariff report coming out any minute.
Yeah, I'm looking at the road ahead for the tariffs this week. And then next week, I'll be looking at this very subject. What is the impact of our upcoming summit with China on how the U.S. government is dealing with trade and tariffs, but not also technology transfer, outbound investment restrictions, inbound investment restrictions, semiconductor policy, and the like. In other words, all of our national security concerns related to China are now being subordinated to the imperative by the president to have a good summit, and that has real impacts across several sectors. And I think that's pretty interesting, and that happens to dovetail right now with a a story you may have seen in the news where the Pentagon is fighting our own AI companies about control over these technologies. And the Secretary of Defense called the CEO of Anthropic to the carpet and threatened their business and their Pentagon contracts if they didn't hand over the keys to their technology to the Pentagon. Anthropic's refusing, and it's kind of a watershed moment because as we are trying to compete with China, we're also having a conflict between our government and our tech industry over who really controls these technologies and what the rules of the road are, especially when it comes to war making.
Well, we'll certainly look forward to reading all that. And Zach, what are you working on next? What's on your plate?
Main part of my work right now is certainly beyond the sort of normal trade compliance, national security compliance issues, is working with a lot of sort of newer defense tech startup companies that are either working in, critical capabilities on the technology side, mining, bringing processing capabilities for critical minerals, rare earths to the United States, and really collaborating with the U.S. government to make sure that these supply chains that we need, across the board, running the range of the critical inputs that we need for the manufacturing sector, making sure that we have a healthy industry in the United States. And then to the extent that, China opens up the floodgates again, we get those price protections. So building, in short, building the industrial base is what is taking up most of my time. And it is a labor of love because it is something we need. And I'm really happy to be partnering with a lot of incredible companies to do that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Josh and Zach, for joining us. Obviously, this is an issue we're going to be covering very closely on an ongoing basis at WP Intelligence. And before we wrap, a quick reminder to our audience, you can request a WP Intelligence platform demo by clicking a link on your screen. And we'll send our live audience a link to the recording of today's briefing. And please do take a moment to complete the short audience survey that we'll send you. Your feedback directly shapes what we do next. And join us next Friday for a briefing on the AI data center building boom, both the political backlash, but some surprising environmental silver linings that are coming out of the huge number of data centers that are being built and how they are dealing with the construction industry. It's a fascinating report that our energy and climate analyst Catherine Clay recently published. So we'll have Catherine on and special guests, and we look forward to seeing you next Friday. In the meantime, have a wonderful weekend.